Most people, unfortunately, are first-order thinkers. They very rarely take secondary and tertiary effects into formula for thinking about something.
When you design protocols, if they're successful, you might not be able to change them. So you want to be extremely mindful of designing them in the right way and thinking about, the second order consequences of doing so.
Complex problems evolve over time. You never truly solve them. You have to kind of stay in a loop of constantly paying attention to them and solving them.
We basically funded 30-ish people to explore protocols across all of their fields of experience.
Civilization progresses by increasing the number of actions we can do without thinking about them. You have to think with 100, 200-year timelines, which means that you are thinking about a horizon over which cultural values will change. Technologies don't get adopted because the proponents prove right and the critics prove wrong. It's because the critics basically die out. I think proponents are
right. It advances one funeral at a time. Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops very special day today. I have my principal researcher and writer, Ed William, joining me as a podcast because I'm dealing with two exceptionally smart people, and I just didn't think I would have the brain power to do it alone. My guests today are Tim Beiko and Venkatesh Rao, who have been doing something really, really cool over the summer. Tim is the head of the core protocol meetings for Ethereum, and Venkatesh is a writer extraordinaire who writes for the Ribbon Farm blog and consults. You guys might remember our chat with Venkatesh about his gig economy series, but now we're going to be talking about their Summer of Protocols. Is that like the Summer of George, guys?
We're trying to keep it a cross between Summer of George and Summer of Code.
I love it. I love it. So I think this is super cool. I read all about it. You funded a bunch of researchers to be able to connect the conversations happening around Ethereum protocols with other areas. So, gents, tell us, what is a Summer of Protocols? What are protocols for our audience who haven't read the background material, and why should we care?
Yeah, maybe I could get started here, and Venkat, you can add some color after. But the idea for this came a while back, where as you mentioned, I work on the Ethereum protocol, and it's kind of a weird. It's a weird thing to work on, right? It's not quite a product. It's not quite like a technology platform. It's kind of this new protocol, for lack of a better word, that we've created. And about a year and a half ago, I was wondering, how should we go about stewarding this thing? How should we think about, what the evolution over the next 10 years looks like? And I reached out to Venkat because I saw from his newsletter, he was starting to spend more and more time thinking about blockchains. So I asked him, do you want to help me think through this and kind of the questions here? So we had a couple calls about it. And then my takeaway from that was, this is already valuable, but me and Venkat are way too narrow to do this. So I asked Venkat, do you want to come and talk with some other people at the Ethereum Foundation and help us, more as an organization, think through this? And we spent about 6 months doing that. And our takeaway after those 6 months was kind of the same thing, where it was still too narrow. Looking at just the problems of Ethereum, you keep running into these analogies where, you'll be saying, oh, Ethereum is just like a company, or it's just like a country, or it's just like a tech platform. And that helps you get, a bit of understanding, but these analogies fall apart pretty quickly as you start to get into the weeds. And so we came up with this idea that, Ethereum is not the only context in which protocols are used. And there's obviously protocols across a ton of other domains. And so maybe the way to approach this was not to just look at Ethereum specifically, but to try to understand what protocols are. Are there recurring problems? Are there recurring questions, that show up in blockchains? Yes, but that maybe show up in architecture, that maybe show up in healthcare, that maybe show up in, workplace safety. And the idea was that if we find some problems that resonate across all those domains, or, some better frameworks or some better insights, then they're probably sound enough that we can go and apply them back. Obviously, in our case, to things like Ethereum, but hopefully in a bunch of other people's cases in their respective domains. And that's kind of where the seed started for Cyber Protocols. And then from there, we basically funded 30-ish people to, explore protocols across all of their sort of fields of experience and put all of their findings together. And Venkat was the person who effectively led that research program over the past several months.
Yeah, I think that covers most of the ground. I'll add to that since you asked, like, what is protocols and why should we care? Actually, when I came on this podcast last, what we talked about, the gig economy, it's a very good example of what protocols are and why we should care. Like, we talk about corporations and organizations and being employees of corporations. Those are kind of like industrial age platforms for organizing the labor economy, but it's very hard to define what the gig economy is. But if you think in terms of protocols, it becomes slightly clearer. The gig economy is a set of interacting protocols that allows somebody like me to exist kind of like in outer space without being inside any organization. I use Zoom for talking with clients. I use FreshBooks for billing clients. I have if I were to drive Uber, I would use an API and an app to like make money without being an employee. So a set of interacting protocols organizes the labor economy. And between like 1980 to today, it grew from like barely a few percentage points, like to double-digit percentage of the labor economy is organized in this nebulous way. And that's the power of protocolization. And to connect to something Tim said, this is why we, over the summer, became convinced that protocols are like a first-class citizen for thinking about the world. You should not be analogizing them to nations or corporations or other like constructs that we're used to thinking about with. You should think in terms of like protocols are this first-class citizen that allows human civilization to be organized in seemingly nebulous ways, but with very hard edges that allow very interesting things to happen. And the gig economy is a good example. That's like, not a blockchain, but it's a set of protocols.
Yeah, and that's what I got excited about when I was reading all the material. What would be the best analogy? Would it be to the old idea of narratives, because you cover that and you cover the 5 different narratives that protocols can help with? We're going to get to that later. Are we looking at deeper structure here in terms are these patterns? Are what's the best analogy? An axiom?
So I think this is where the metaphors to existing concepts kind of like draws astray. So there are parts of protocols that seem like narratives. And I personally have been very interested in that aspect. And I've been writing some essays on like protocol narratives. And in a sort of more technical example of that, and this is going back to the Ethereum world, there's this distributed blockchain game called Dark Forest, which is inspired by the Dark Forest trilogy science fiction novels. But it's set up on the blockchain as a little set of worlds that are kind of like planets and they attack each other and so forth. And the whole thing is it's not a video game, it's not a novel, it's not even world building in the sense of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's this set of like technological elements that talk to each other through like messaging rules and allow like a grand narrative to unfold. And we were talking before we started recording about, we both just came from protocol town hall that we hosted by some bleeding edge artist writer Simon de la Rouvière. He experiments with like experimental art, music, storytelling and stuff, and he was telling us about this weird sort of like augmented reality game type thing called SCP, which I think is called Secure and Protect or something. But it's this bunch of people who go around and look at like normal stuff, like you might be in a bus or looking at a vending machine, and they imagine that, weird aliens are inhabiting those machines and they're part of a secret organization that is there to protect the world from these aliens and prevent them from bursting out, so containing these aliens, right? So this is like, it's like Pokemon Go, it's like virtual reality, but it doesn't require those elements. All it requires is for a bunch of people to come to like a consensus on, here are the rough rules we're playing by, how to tell stories. We're not going to use like proprietary materials or photographs, but we're going to like just projectively project a story imagined by us, improvised by us, onto just ordinary reality around us and share it as a wiki website. And it's this wonderful little metaverse that has come up. Novels and video games and video little movies have come out of it. So that's like, it's even more fundamental than world building, I would say. So they've set up like a set of rules on which a world can grow, and on top of that world, narratives can unfold. So it's like a couple of layers of below the stack that we're used to thinking of.
Yeah, and it made me kind of think of, I've been reading recently about Conway's Game of Life, and I thought that to Byte Connect, yours is a little more sophisticated, but yours is also seemingly another thing that I very much subscribe to. Complex adaptive systems, emergence comes from below, not from above, and that is another thing in which the game you've just described seems to bear out. I started asking the question, Tim, before I think you were going to jump in, so I'll switch it over to you.
Yeah, so I guess this will show like the different background that I come from Venkat. Like I always think of these things from like a very just dry perspective, like what's like the simplest like instantiation of like a protocol. And I think part of the reasons why it's so hard to define it is there's like three like preconditions or like combinations that like I think when you get together, you get a proper protocol, but that you end up focusing on one at a time. And so the first is obviously this concept of rules, right? Like you need some set of constraints. But then when you think only through that lens, you can think of something like an API, right? Like what's the difference between a protocol and an API, or even a language grammar, whether it's like a programming language or a written English, like language like English. There's this concept of rules that's super strong, but it's not necessarily sufficient. I think the other thing that came up with protocols is the idea of ordering really matters, right? And this is where people tend to analogize them to more like social structures, like rituals or, traditions, where like something has to happen to trigger something else in an order. And if you lose that, the protocols tend to not work. And, to take an example, it's like if you wash your hands before they're dirty, the health washing or hand washing health protocol doesn't quite work, right? So this concept of like the ordering in which a step happens more than just the steps themselves is really important. And then the last bit, which is what Venkat was getting at with world building as well, is this idea that the protocol is like a substrate on which more complex things can be built. And this is why I think you end up flip-flopping your thinking that protocols as like simple APIs and then, something like tech platforms or nation states, and you can kind of alternate between those two views so easily, even though they're really, really far from each other, is the idea that like once you have these rules in the specific order that you assign to them, you can build stuff on top of that, and that quickly becomes really powerful. And I'm not sure this is like exhaustive, but it feels like at least a minimal set of things you need to have a proper protocol. And this is what makes like the subject matter so hard is, each of those is like a huge rabbit hole where people have spent tons of time trying to develop like these subparts and trying to like hold them all at like a same level of attention and look at like the higher level protocol construct. It's actually really hard, and that's what we tried to do with all these researchers over the summer. And so I don't know, hopefully there's like another angle that might be helpful to think about like decomposing protocol into subparts and how they fit together.
I think that the rules as constraints in the beginning is a good jumping off point. I've been reading The God Problem by Howard Bloom. I don't know if you guys have read that, but he leads in with some really interesting ideas. The first being about how amazing things can emerge from very simple rules, and he gives as his example termites building their beautiful cathedrals. I don't know whether you guys have ever seen termite mounds in the wild. They are truly stunning and amazing. And essentially, the simple rule was termite goes along. They are very fastidious. They don't like shit all over the floor. They go along. They see a little pellet of termite scat, and they take it, but they go and look at all of the other places they've been put, and then they go on top of the tallest one, and they put it there. And out of that emerged these beautiful cathedrals that termites have built. But then he also connects that to, and I want to ask you guys because I'm not sure about this. He connects it to the ancient Babylonian priests basically inventing writing because of accounting, right? And, they were in charge of making sure that all the worshipers made the right offering to the gods of barley corn. But counting barley corn, like if there's 10,000 of them, counting them one by one is going to be a very laborious and tedious task. So they got their little clay tablet and they did a Y for a 1 and they did a less than sign for a 10. Is there a connection?
Yeah, you're touching on like several points that I think we've been like obsessed with over the summer. So the first one, the termite one, though I'm not familiar with the God problem, we actually had a researcher, Rafa. He did a whole project on swarms and what you can learn from swarms in relation to protocols. And the interesting thing is, swarms have been studied for a long time, flocks of birds and things like that in the wild. But swarms in protocolized environments, like, mob marching through the streets protesting something, that's a different kind of swarm. So there's an interesting sort of relationship between there are the constraints and rules that define a protocol, like Tim mentioned. And then there's the sort of free design space it opens up where you can like have unscripted and even chaotic behaviors. And how swarms behave in a constrained set of rules is kind of like very interesting chaos and order dynamic that kind of creates complexity via emergence. So that's one immediate response point I wanted to make. The other is throughout this program and even before the 6 months where we were doing it within the Ethereum Foundation, we were very inspired by an Ian Whitehead quote, which is goes something like, civilization progresses by increasing the number of actions we can do without thinking about them. And this is like a very profound thought that I think has been inspiring all of our researchers. It became one of our most cited like quotes we would toss at each other. And you can see why that is, right? Like termites literally can't think sophisticated thoughts. The most complex thought they can think is take a little bit of dirt, go to the highest point and deposit it there. And then you get this fractal structure or whatever that emerges, which means at a very hard constraint, any complexity that emerges, 90% of it has to be unconscious. And to your example of things like Babylonian priests, we humans tend to have conceits about like how lofty our philosophical conceptions of our own existence is. But when it comes down to like how we operate in reality, it's literally 90% automatic actions we don't think about. Like Tim said, use the example of washing your hands or like handshakes. These are actions we don't normally think about, but still 99% of the time we do right. And unless something like the pandemic happens, making us rethink, all right, what the hell is a handshake really? Should we rethink what it is? 90% of our actions are automatic, and 90% of the emergent structures of civilization come out through this unconscious process where we might as well be termites, even though we build these lofty religious philosophies on it. Civilization is like closer to a termite mound than we might want to admit, right?
Tim?
Yeah, maybe one quick thing I'll add on that is this segues pretty well into another theme that was recurrent for us, which was like the idea of like dangerous protocols and, them being entrenched and lasting for a long time. So you can see that the termite example is actually a really good one because it shows you, something with like a very limited reasoning ability, being able to build a structure that's like much bigger than it is, which much more complexity. And it also shows you how hard it would be to change that. Like, say that for some reason it was bad that termites built these structures. How would you even get them to coordinate on doing something else, given like the level of agency they're operating at is like, bring this thing to the highest point. And this is something that came up over and over in the research. And the research on Swarm was an example of that. There was somebody literally just researching dangerous protocols. But the idea that once you have this kind of accumulation of small, simple behavior that's bounded by some constraints, it can lead to really strong outcomes that are either positive or negative. But it's very hard to build the coordination around changing those outcomes once the protocols is set in place. And obviously, the hand washing and handshaking examples is another great one because, it takes something on the scale of like a global pandemic to have people rethink something as simple as like handshakes. And so this is another huge sort of area of research. Like these protocols tend to be very sticky. And the Whiteman quote as well actually has, you can think about it two different ways, right? One is like, it's great. We get to automate more and more of like our complexity stack as a society, as we become more protocolized. But the other implication is that as these things have like disappeared and society just does them automatically, it's very hard to debug them or to change them because they're sort of taken for granted, and so much other stuff is built on top. So yeah, I think there's like a big area of research around like when you design protocols, if they're successful, you might not be able to change them. So you want to be extremely mindful of designing them in the right way, and thinking about the second order consequences of doing so.
Ed?
Yeah, I a couple of questions based on that, really. I'll ask them both, and you can answer which one you find more interesting. So the first one was, would as the world becomes increasingly protocolized, does that mean that the world is effectively becoming less agentic? Is a protocolized one or one which inherently has less agency? And the second one, tied into the point Tim was just making, is, are there any behaviors or areas or sectors or however you want to phrase it that shouldn't be protocolized, that do not lend themselves to a protocol first way of thinking or a protocol first way of approaching the problem?
You want to pick one of those to field, Tim?
So maybe on the first one, I feel like I have conflicting thoughts, but it feels to me like the barrier to entry to create protocols is maybe lowering because you get distribution through the internet, you get better tools like, blockchains and AI. So even if, I'm not sure if I agree that a more protocolized world leads to people being less agentic, but I think we are moving to a world where more people can start protocols, and protocols have like the ability to shape a huge number of people's behaviors. So maybe that's how I would think about it. And this comes up a ton, like people talk about is like AI, like, is ChatGPT agentic or whatnot. And I think the way I think about something like that is a bit similar to like a blockchain, where like on Ethereum, obviously Ethereum is not like self-aware or anything, but you can trigger like a huge chain reaction with a relatively small input. You can start a transaction and then have it execute any type of code anywhere in the world, replicated across, tens of thousands of nodes. And AI is a bit similar, where like, obviously the AI today is not like, coming out of the chat box and doing stuff. There's like a huge amount of like energy conservation in a way, where like with a small prompt, you can get, ChatGPT to do some huge output. And I think it's like, as you get these more and more powerful tools, people can build protocols with them. And yeah, I'm not sure if the outcome of that is like a less agentic world or not. It definitely feels like we'll see more powerful protocols emerging soon. Yeah.
I think I have a more strongly opinionated take on agency, because I don't think it's like, the word agentic is interesting because I think it was popularized by recent AI discourses. But this dynamic you're pointing out goes back like to the earliest technology, right? Like there's always this dynamic of it increases the overall agency pie, but it kind of might cut back agency for particular groups of people, right? Like you have some machinery that automates something, whoever was doing the artisan work, the Luddites or whatever, their agency goes down, but other people who are designing machinery goes up. So it's the whole standard argument in economics of like, there's a lump of labor fallacy. So the lump of labor fallacy, I think, is actually equivalent to like a lump of agency fallacy, right? So the lump of labor fallacy, for those of you who are not familiar, is the idea that there's a fixed amount of work to be done. And in a growing economy, that's obviously not true. Like, textile artisans or, farmers using their muscle power, they might go out of business or lose work. But overall, the amount of work to be done simply increases, and people come up with more and more things they want to do. And I think this is where I go back to Neil Stephenson's idea of like Eloy and Morlocks. In his essay, In the Beginning Was the Command Line, which riffs off like a H.G. Wells story. But the idea that when technology progresses, it creates this breed of superhumans who are a minority and have like vastly increased superhuman levels of agency. And on that particular technological dimension, everybody else may become like much less agentic, right? So that does happen. Like, take automobiles, for example. In the beginning, to drive a car, you had to be a little bit of an auto mechanic and you had to know something about like repairing engines, replacing spark plugs, things like that. And as cars became more and more sophisticated, a small minority of people are now superhuman car fixer type people who know a huge amount about like very sophisticated machines. The rest of us are like, my car won't turn on. Do I call AAA or whatever, right? So it's this split that happens. So my belief is the overall agency pie is always expanding, but because in the short term it gets rearranged in a way, people caught on the wrong side, which is usually large numbers of very vocal and concentrated people in special interest groups, they tend to have like very vocal reactions as zero sum or negative sum way. And since we brought up AI, I do want to mention that AI is going through an interesting inflection point now, where you had these big centralized models, and just earlier this week, OpenAI announced its big new product line where anybody can code up their own GPT assistant, right? And this, to my mind, is like shows the importance of protocols, because we've moved to the protocolization stage of AI itself. Because now we're going to talk about what private data are you uploading to OpenAI? What are the security and privacy guarantees around your little GPT trained on your data? How is that going to interact if you put it on the marketplace and like it interacts with other GPTs? So again, suddenly a lot of people, like artists, might be losing their job because AI can now produce artwork. Like we should mention, in our publishing of this research material, we are using AI-generated tower images, which are turning out beautifully, by the way. So yes, there are people who are going to be losing some agency, but other people are gaining the power to like just program up their own little assistant bots, right? So it's just is like a 200-year story, and it's going to like keep repeating, but agency, I think, keeps increasing.
On the 200-year story, you actually go into that at some level of detail, looking at pre-industrial protocols all the way up through the industrial era and now to our current era, in which you find memes are inserting themselves into the process as well. Now, I know you don't mean memes in the Dawkins sense of memes. You mean memes more in the internet sense of memes. But talk a bit about that, about the as you say, we're looking at a long sweep of history here, and protocols and world building and stories and narratives have always been around to a greater or lesser extent. I think now, with the world completely connected, they move a lot faster than they used to. But either of you, please, if you would jump in on that idea.
I think Tim's favorite research project is appropriate here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a bit more narrow than like all the protocols over 200 years. But I think the one that we have that looks in a very narrow domain and evaluates it over a long period of time is Timber's project, which is around workplace safety. And to me, this project validated that like Summer Protocols was worth it, because, as I said, I work on blockchain, never been on a commercial construction site in my life. And as I was reading the essay, I was like, wow, he's describing exactly what I work on, even though he's describing coal mining in like the 1870s or something. And the overall idea is that, workplace safety protocols were invented early on because workplace safety was just a huge problem. People would go into these mines and they would explode and they would all die. So then they came up with some ways to figuring out, is there gas in the mine? And protocols to doing this through trial and error while minimizing casualties. You can imagine the most naive approach is one person goes there, lights a match, it explodes. You still lost that person. So over time, people came up with like, they were able to identify different types of gas and whatnot and be a bit smarter about it. And then, you fast forward a bit, the mines aren't blowing up anymore, but you have things like long-term health consequences, right? Like, okay, you're not dying, today, but like, oh, you realize 10 years in, you have all these issues. So there's more and more workplace safety standards that happen. How do you protect workers and whatnot? And then you reach a point where you've pretty much eliminated most of the risks. It's pretty safe to work in these industrial environments. Where you start to get these weird accidents. It's not that the mine explodes, but it's, some person is backing up the truck at night and there's no light, and, somebody walks in front of it and gets rolled over or something like that. And so you go from a world where you're like observing with pretty high frequency these pretty catastrophic events to one where safety, most of the time things are going well, you're not observing anything, and you get this weird outlier event. And people will then continue to add these workplace safety protocols because not only you've sort of created this meta protocol at this point where it's like, okay, when bad things happen, we should do a retrospective and set up some new measures and deal with that. But the benefits you get at this point are much lower because you're not stopping the mine from blowing up. You're, trying to overfit to this one weird edge case and adding all these measures. And potentially, even if you're not just slowing down productivity, maybe you're creating new edge cases by adding all of this complexity. And so this one for me was really interesting because it shows how it's really hard to get to this sweet spot of what's the right level of protocol complexity? Where should workplace safety standards end up at? And both from a just objective point of view, what are we willing to tolerate, but also from a social point of view, where if you've set this culture and this, sort of social protocol that when something happens, we respond to it, then, you get these weirder and weirder edge cases that happen because you've sort of blocked out every other potential failure mode. But you're still at a spot where you feel like you have to add something. And I won't, bore you with the corollary and smart contract and blockchain development, but you basically see the exact same thing, right? Where, there's maybe speed run in 7 years instead of 200. But we're trying to figure out the right level of safety and security concerns, and trying even just coming up with good heuristics for, okay, is this actually a failure mode, or is this just, a random edge case that we should just accept because, it happens once every so often? It's a really hard problem. So yeah, I think that was something that was kind of interesting to see evolve over one, such a long period of time, and two, where, yeah, a domain that had nothing to do with tech or the internet, and where, 95% of the actual content comes from before the internet, was directly applicable to what I do. And so the hope is if we can find more and more of those connections and start building, theories around them, and the theory works as well for workplace safety as Ethereum development, then we know it's robust, right?
The thing that jumps out at me there, though, as you were talking about safety protocols, I just kind of envisioned the basic ones, right? We put the canary down, the canary doesn't die. It means everything's okay down there. It's very, very simple stuff. But then I kind of see Ptolemaic circles being drawn. We're all familiar with Ptolemy's astronomy that they needed to keep adding all of the various circles to make to take advantage of new observations. Do you think that's one of the reasons why these things can either grow unwieldy or perhaps inadvertently cause us to over-index on safety over other things?
Yeah, and I think, and the reason why is it is a hard problem because obviously, the canary is one circle, and I don't know what the full workplace safety protocols are today, but that's, 1 million. Where do you put something like the risk of developing lung cancer after 10 years of working in a mine, right? It's clearly something where, you can argue that it's, from the perspective of the earliest protocols, it's this huge addition in complexity, but it's probably, a pretty frequent failure mode, and something that type of work. So there is this tendency to add more and more, and it's very hard. Not only is it hard when you're close to it to figure out if the marginal circle is beneficial or not, but I'd argue even if you have the benefit of hindsight and you're detached, figuring out exactly which circles to remove is super hard. And again, sorry. Yeah, I'll pause here, Venkat, if you want to speak.
Yeah, I just want to interject an interesting example that I think makes a particular point, which is the evolution of safety in nuclear submarines. So one of the most compelling A/B test examples of the importance of evolving complexity in safety protocols is that the Russian Navy, nuclear Navy, had, I think, something like 17 major accidents through the Cold War era. The U.S. Navy had none. And this was because entirely due to Admiral Hyman Rickover, who's like this famous guy who built the American nuclear submarine fleet as well as America's nuclear program. And he basically, one of the things was like he focused on like engineering excellence, operational excellence, safety, things like that. And you can see why this difference was so stark. It's because nuclear submarine technology is a technology with a very high ceiling of complexity. You might have started with like, Fermi doing like an atomic pile experiment and starting the first reaction and then the Manhattan Project. But you can see that fundamentally you're dealing with nature at its most complex and subtle. And any technology you build on it, especially if you make it more powerful, more capable, smaller, more compact reactors that can run for longer, it's going to get more and more complex. And your safety protocols have to keep up. Now, this is I think a research area, and maybe different industries have different ceilings of complexity. So I suspect part of what's going on here is there's, of course, like, sociological effects that when a field is very young and immature, more sort of like people with high risk appetite go into that. Like, crypto in its early decade attracted risk-taking types. Gold rushes attract risk-taking types. As technologies mature, it attracts like more conservative people. But also those more conservative people build the technology in like, more patient, detailed, complex ways. Like it takes a different personality to come up with one brilliant idea for a blockchain. And 10 years later to build on that, like some of the things Tim might be able to mention, like some of the things on the Ethereum roadmap currently, they don't look like the Wild West anymore. Like 2009 to 2014 when Bitcoin and early Ethereum were building up. What's going on today with higher levels of sophisticated Ethereum, they are really much more complex. They look much more like nuclear submarines than primitive coal mines to me. So there's like sociological selection effects of who selects into working on a technology, what the actual leading edge problems are, how complex it's getting, and therefore what kinds of weird accidents can happen and what you need to do about them. And to add to Tim's point about like outliers and weirdness becoming more common, the consequences also become more complex, right? If you have a small early nuclear reactor, it melting down is not that big a deal. If you have like a bleeding edge nuclear reactor that's powering an entire city, that melting down is a big deal. If you have an early airliner with like 10 people flying in it, the airliner crashing is 10 people lost. In 2013 and 14, you had those two Malaysia Air, with very weird accidents. One getting shot down over Ukraine, the other getting like hijacked in a very weird way and getting lost over the Indian Ocean. That was 300 plus people dying because of a very weird outlier thing, despite like 50 layers of airline safety protocols to prevent that happening, right? Consequences increase, the weirdness of outliers increase, the complexity increases, and the staffing or people involved in the technology churns through from like highly sort of like risk accepting to highly risk averse, and they're working on different problems. So there's like a whole life cycle here. And I think, Timber Shaw's coal mine paper, one of its interesting contributions is it comes up with a speculative theory of the evolution of protocols across time for precisely these reasons. So yeah, I wanted to throw the nuclear submarine example in this pool of examples to think about. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to like hijack Tim. Yeah,
No, that was actually very instructive. And it leads to the question, at what point do we, what's the best way to allow protocols to build? And if we borrow from development, open source, closed source, what do you guys think?
I think this is really hard. I mean, this is why I started this whole thing and reached out to Venkat in the first place, because I think that, the challenge almost is like, if these things are successful, then you have very little opportunity to change it. And the you here as well is an interesting one, because if it's successful, these protocols tend to have these very long lifespans. So, you probably won't be around when it has to be changed, and you have to think about, the like second order implications. So frankly, I don't know. I think one useful framework we came up with though during the summer is defining bad protocols is much easier than defining good ones. And that's maybe one tool that you can use if you're thinking about that, where the canonical example we came up with was like the TSA, right? If I say just like the words TSA, you just smiled there, you like immediately get all these like visceral reactions of why it's poorly designed at so many levels. And, if you spend 5 minutes thinking about all of the design constraints of the TSA, you can get a good picture of like, why is this like a bad protocol? And this is like much more illuminating than, say, if I tell you HTTP, you don't have like this emotional reaction. You sort of assume it's just working in the background, even though it's one of the most used protocols. Or same, if I tell you like washing your hands, the gap that it takes someone to go from like looking at hand washing to like, okay, how many lives have we saved through disease? It's like a much less visceral sort of thought process than, why is the TSA bad? Or, why is another broken protocol not working? So I think that's one of the most like optimistic tools we've come up with to try and think through that, where if you're able to actually think of your protocol, what would be the worst version of it and what would lend it to go there? That would be at least a good first step in trying to minimize those negative consequences. And especially in terms of like second order impacts. So another example that came up during our summer was the idea of speed bumps in front of schools. And this was contested research, but it shows you how hard it is. So obviously, why would you want speed bumps in front of schools? Because you don't want people to drive quick and hit kids with their cars. And then there's some research around, actually the speed bumps slow down ambulances in these areas to an extent where like people die in the ambulance more often than kids were being hit in an accident. And this shows you like an extremely simple protocol, like, that anyone can understand. People are going too quickly on this road. You just add something and you solve like the visible cause. But the second order effects are really hard. And then they're also much harder to build an intuition for. So, the ratio of like how many school kid accidents do you need to prevent to make it worth it to, probabilistically delay ambulances by this much in this town. It becomes a much harder thing to undo than it was to do in the first place, because you can get people to rally around, protecting the kids. But then, taking you off the speed bumps just becomes really, really hard. So I guess this would be my one takeaway so far, is just trying to think through the negatives and the second order impacts. And like the dystopian version of your protocol succeeding can hopefully help you build a better version that, takes some of those issues into account. Yeah.
I want to jump. I want to just really quick jump on that with a question and an observation. Like, so the reality is most people, unfortunately, are first order thinkers. They very rarely take secondary and tertiary effects into the formula for thinking about something, right? And then you also mentioned another aspect of this, which seems very important to me, and that is the visceral reaction of other humans, right? Like, it's very, very easy to get a bunch of parents irate over the fact that it might be a good idea to take the speed bumps out because fuck the ambulances. I want my kid to be safe. I mean, just respond if both of you wouldn't mind.
I can take that one. The previous question you sort of posed is closed better than open, that kind of thing. And one of the things that I think we all discovered was developing what we call protocol literacy requires sort of like backing away from like the obvious sort of like, I don't know, sacred cows that you might otherwise rally around. So the challenge to becoming a second order thinker is, when faced with such a thing, typically people will reach for their most favorite sacred thing and say something like, if they go second order at all, it's like, what we need is a strong centralized mayor who will like look at this holistically and solve the speed bumps versus ambulances problem, right? So we reach for that. And invariably, I think what happens is when you develop a fetish for, centralized versus decentralized, open versus closed, you're not entering sort of the dialectical relationship with the problem domain. So that's like a complicated phrase, but complex problems evolve over time. You never truly solve them. You have to kind of like stay in a loop of constantly paying attention to them and like solving them. and you cannot afford to get locked onto like any sacred cow, like, centralized or open or whatever. And the kind of like the exercise Tim described of like think of the worst protocol you can. We actually did that at the researcher retreat over the summer, where I think people were calling them Kafka-esque protocols. So think of the Kafka-esque one. And this is an element of what we think of as protocol literacy, which is stop your first order reaction of centralized bad, decentralized good, and just stop that train of thought and instead pick up one of these disciplines, like asking yourself the sort of like provocative question, what's the most Kafkaesque version of this that can happen? And then play that thought experiment through. And maybe you'll discover that the most Kafkaesque thing you can think of is actually a completely open source and decentralized version of the thing, right? It's like the examples we've been talking about. TSA is not super centralized. Yes, there's some centralized directives, but it does involve like all local airports. The other example we talked about, speed bumps and ambulances, that's a bunch of interacting like local government things with like highway state laws and stuff. So it's like all your obvious first order sacred cows get challenged if you actually force yourself to literally think in a literate way about the particular problem. So I would say that's probably the big takeaway from the program. Like, how do you get to protocol literacy? Step 1, throw away your sacred cows. And step 2, build a few disciplines that allow you to like, I don't know, enter into an open-ended conversation with the problem. It's like, all right, that didn't work. Let's come at it another way. This is the problem with externalities with speed bumps. Maybe we can come at it in a different way and give ambulances a different lane to go through, right? So if you keep the problem in an open-ended sort of questioning mode, that itself sort of bootstraps you into the second order way of thinking. And I think that's a big part of like being good at protocols.
And I think maybe 2 things I'll add to that. One is when we were doing this exercise, another thing we tried to think about was, are there protocols that like have never changed, right? Like once you get them, they're done. And one thing we came up with was nuclear codes for the president, right? We're like, oh, okay, this is clearly something, it's not a rocket science. Well, it's like very high stakes, but there seems to be a protocol today and it seems to have been stable. And literally during our workshop, there was an article on Bloomberg around how they changed those protocols over the summer. So that was like our one example, and it didn't work out. And I think the other thing that I found really helpful is actually like engaging with the protocols. And I need a better word than engaging, but there's some aspect where when you start like thinking through thought experiments with it, or trying to break something, or almost thinking of like the protocols as like physical Legos and, trying to rearrange parts of it, that seems to be a much more fruitful approach than say, like the approach, like the brain space you get when you're trying to like solve a math problem, or you're, trying to go like linearly through some step of sequences, or, writing code. There's something around like thinking of like these protocols as like objects in space that you can rearrange, that seems to be more fruitful than trying to think of it as more theory or a set of rules that you're writing in like a I don't know, one-dimensional or linear way. And this is, I think, something that we're going to try. We've managed, I think, to convey this to people who are like full-time in the program, and, we paid to just think about that. But I think this is one of the big challenges. How do you scale this, 10, 100, 1,000x? Like, how do you get somebody, say they want to spend 2 hours thinking about protocols, to have them think about it through that lens, rather than have them trying to say, read the equivalent of a Wikipedia article about HTTP or workplace safety and not quite get the feeling that like these are malleable constructs that can have really different outcomes depending on how you arrange them.
Well, I was just going to ask, as protocols are so malleable and sort of interoperable, so you're saying how a building protocol informed how you think about Ethereum and that sort of thing, and also if there's such sort of fundamental building blocks of our behaviors, why do you think more people aren't talking about protocols? I mean, I outside of the Ethereum community, and outside of what you guys are doing, I wasn't particularly familiar with them until I read your stuff. Yeah. It doesn't feel like they're widely.
I'd say, yeah. So I guess the way I would frame it is probably more people than you'd expect think about protocols, but they think about it in like a tangential way. So like say again, you're working on like a construction site, like you think about workplace safety protocols, but like you think of your domain as like construction, and like the workplace safety protocol is one subset. And I think it's just because it's something that's embedded in every single domain, there just hasn't been, I don't know, maybe blockchains are just like the first time where we have enough people just focusing on that, and there's so little physical domain around it that we get to spend more of our time thinking about protocols. Maybe web protocols are the exception, but then, yeah, it feels like in every other domain except like maybe web and blockchain stuff, protocols are just like a second or third order concern, and people do end up interacting with it, but it's just not their main focus, and they think about something else more. Yeah.
And I'll add to that, this is not unique to protocols as a sort of targeted field of study. Like if you think about economics, for example, economics wasn't a thing until Adam Smith. Like if you read like medieval history books, like I was reading during the pandemic, I was reading about the Black Death and the plague, and like, wow, there's like lots of chapters on economic organizations in the years leading up to the plague, and how artisan guilds organized the economy. And it was quite clear that they didn't think of themselves as doing economics. They were literally part of like social and cultural sort of like ritual space. Like they had lots of like laws about what you could and couldn't do. And they were all driven by concerns about maintaining the social hierarchy, making sure apprentices didn't get above their station. You could tell that their entire frame for thinking about economic activity, which is what the artisans of the 13th century were involved in, it was not economic at all. It was like cultural programming, societal stability maintenance. They didn't think of economics, though they used like token currencies to transact and stuff. And then you have Adam Smith, then you have like a few generations of economics. Now you have entire like schools of thought of economics. And there's kind of like an economics way of thinking about the world that didn't exist in the 13th century. So like to make an analogy to what we are trying to do here, there was something it was like to be economics literate in like, 1900 that kind of didn't really exist before Adam Smith. Like before Adam Smith, you might be like socially literate, socially literate, or like politically sophisticated, or like be good at maintaining the social order in other ways. But there was no such thing as being like economics literate. And then Adam Smith gave people like generalized frameworks for doing it. And now we all intuitively approach certain problems with an economics mindset. It's like we ask, what are the incentives? What are the price and supply demand dynamics? We have like a set of like literacy tools to think about problems in an economics way. So even though economics as sort of like a domain of stuff has existed forever, like millennia, economics as a way of thinking about that regime of activity is like only 200 years old. So protocols too, like handshaking and all the, ceremonial ritual protocols, they've existed since the Bronze Age. But like economics, we are going through a threshold of, this stuff has gotten sophisticated enough, and we now have like the beginnings of like a universal way of thinking about it, that we can actually explicitly talk about it with like, protocol science as just like with economics. And so I think we're going through such an inflection point right now.
And you make that point rather clearly, that you make the case that training people to be protocols first type thinkers is going to hopefully replace the nation state thinker, or the various ways in which, as you point out, right, we didn't have the field of economics. And it was just like we didn't have science until Aristotle called it science. It basically invented that brand new way of thinking. How are you going to go about, other than the obvious, what you did this summer, which I think is wonderful, but how do you go about taking the next level up to help people become more protocols first type thinkers, as opposed to the other methods that we're far more familiar with and comfortable with?
Yeah, maybe I think to take the economics and science example, one thing that's really worth highlighting there is economics and science existed in people's lives before, and they didn't have like a label for it, right? And this is the thing that, Adam Smith gives you the first set of like really good labels. And then if you're just, some random shopkeeper and you're introduced to these concepts, you can then sort of bucket these intuitions you had about how you're running your business in these labels and potentially build on them and go from there. So I think this is a part that's like really valuable, where it's not that like you're inventing new labels more than you're inventing new behaviors or new realities. So the hope is that if the labels are actually good, people recognize that and then they can like apply them. And this is the motivation for having people from different domains was this. Again, it's, if the label is good enough for blockchain and workplace safety and, architecture, then it's probably generalizable enough. So I think that we're at the spot where after this first summer, this was basically our hypothesis that we wanted to validate or not. Is, is there actually like a thread across different domains that is protocols? I think we've confirmed that there is. And now I think that the next step is figuring out, are there some big questions or some big problems that recur in all of these? And can we get people to start thinking about solutions or, answers to those? And then I think once we have those, or at least like a framework for answering them, you get closer to something like, Adam Smith's, like, say invisible hand, or, like supply and demand. Like if you're able to have these, these mental models or these frame of references, then it's very easy for people to map on their local problems to them and hopefully make some progress. And same thing with science, it's like, you think of like the scientific method is like, whether you're a baker or you're a doctor or you're an astronomer, you can use the scientific method and, lay out some hypotheses, try to record observations and whatnot. And then maybe you then tweak it, right? Like the way that the scientific method works in astronomy is different than it would work, in like high-end gastronomy today. Like, but at least, laying down these mental models, these concepts, these theoretical frameworks. I don't know if that's our next steps. It's maybe 2 steps ahead. We're at the spot where I think we have a good understanding of like the general areas of concern or like interesting inquiry. And then next step is like, can we get some common frameworks out of that?
I think that your point there is very well taken about lacking a term or a label, right? Because you think about why did Darwin succeed with evolutionary theory, where his grandfather Erasmus had similar theories, but he didn't have a label like natural selection, which his grandson did. So when the grandson had the label, all of a sudden it caught on because it allowed us to allow it into our thought process. Whereas Erasmus just, he had the ideas, but he didn't have the label. But then the other thing that I think, and I go back to the hand washing example, I'm sure you're both very familiar with the Semmelweis experience when he took over the ward for pregnant women in Vienna. And this is back during a time when male doctors felt that it was unmanly to wash your hands. So they would go from dissecting a cadaver to giving birth to a child without washing their hands. And Semmelweis, who was given the command of that unit, wondered, gee, I wonder why the women who are attended by the male doctors are dying at a rate that's 4x the rate of the ones that are attended by the midwives. And so they came up with a bunch of different theories, and ultimately he disproved all of their silly ones. And he said, I think it's because you're not washing your hands. And so he instituted the protocol of the doctors cleaning their hands in a solution that was a lot tougher than soap. But here's the problem. So Semmelweis was political, and he got involved in a political demonstration that the powers that be didn't very much like, and that didn't work out for Dr. Semmelweis. He was kicked out. He was ultimately institutionalized. But the person who took over from him, with all of the data right there, in other words, Semmelweis starts forcing all male doctors to wash their hands. Death rate among women attended by male doctors plummets. And he reversed it because he's like, what is all this effeminate washing of hands for men? How do we deal with that?
This is actually the particular example I've thought about in one particular angle it brings up is very important. The sheer amount of time it takes for protocols to evolve actually puts them in a different class of social, political phenomena than regular technologies. There's this great article, I just looked it up again, by Atul Gawande, the surgeon who writes in the New Yorker. It's called Slow Ideas. And he talks about anesthesia and antiseptics, which are down the same story. And these are the opposite of things like the iPhones, which, comes out in a dramatic keynote, same as OpenAI stuff yesterday. Everybody's wowed. And next day, millions of people are eagerly rushing to try them, right? To the extent they can. These ideas, they seem mundane, and it takes 100 years to sink in. And I think protocols tend to have this character of, this is not a 5-year big bang marketing thing. It's not even a 10-year venture capital sort of investment cycle thing. It's not even a 30-year government R&D, NSF grant making or space program type thing. You have to think with 100, 200-year timelines, which means that you are thinking about a horizon over which cultural values will change, prejudices will change, entire compositions of the people involved in a picture may change, right? So in your example, Semmelweis started out strong with good scientific reactions to what he was seeing. Then his old prejudices kicked in. But then the whole phenomenon of what they say about technologies don't get adopted because the proponents prove right and the critics prove wrong. It's because the critics basically die out. I think proponents are
right.
they have
it advances one funeral at a time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is also, it goes with the Whitehead quote about things going into where you don't have to think about them, the automaticity of things. We've talked in the last decades about the idea of digital migrants versus digital natives. People like my dad's age, he's in his 80s, still fumble with computers and phones. People my age, we started out in pre-internet era. So I grew up in the 80s with early PCs. And then there's people who were born with the internet, then people who were born with mobile phones. And each generation, for a very long evolving technology or protocol, more things are kind of in their unconscious right when they're born. And they're the young babies today, they're why can't I touch my TV and it should do stuff, right? It's they expect all screens to be touch screens. So that's the behavior that's gotten automatic. Same thing with it's not that men today are necessarily less chauvinistic than in Semmelweis's era, but you are born into an era where it's much more common to treat women as equal in at least some workplaces like healthcare, more as equals than it was in the 19th century or whatever. And even if you might have the same psychological dispositions, you internalize very different sets of unconscious behaviors, and you're kind of born unconsciously protocol literate in a bunch of areas. Others that are being developed as you're coming of age, you might have more trouble acquiring. And there's a whole Douglas Adams joke about this, which is anything invented before you're 35 is natural. Anything after 35 is against the nature of reality. I think we're all like that. All of us are going to go through that phase where we look at something that comes up in 2040 and say, this is wrong. This is not the way the world should work. And then we will be the crotchety old people who are the part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So yeah, and one of the motivations for this problem that Tim can talk about more is, given the long timeline and the fact that you want these things to enter a stable, mature old age, which we talk of as the ossification problem in Ethereum, it's hard. If you want a blockchain protocol to get a stable maturity after you're dead, how do you plan for the cultural environment then, right? So it's fundamentally a different level of technology problem.
The thing that springs to mind is the idea of cultural evolution, right? And that speaks to what you just said. We do culturally evolve, and science advancing one funeral at a time is sad but true. But another aspect that you spend time on in your work is the fictional treatment of protocols. I was really intrigued by that. Because fiction can be very transformative if it's done right. And you give some great examples with some of my favorite authors. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a couple for our audience, that would be great.
Yeah, I was thinking more in the context of the program, but yes, it's kind of interesting that while this program was going on, at a personal level, I was very into like narrative protocols in particular. And my favorite right now has to be J.G. Ballard, who's kind of like this really towering figure in science fiction, but not as famous as like Asimov or Heinlein or others, because he's the science fiction writer other science fiction writers read to like get their big ideas. And now that I'm like in protocol headspace, every single thing I'm reading by J.G. Ballard is like striking me as this is like perfect protocol fiction. Like I'll give you a couple of examples connecting to our program. His novel High Rise is about a bunch of people who live in like a high rise and basically stratify into lower, middle, and upper classes and like turn the high rise building into a war zone where they're fighting over control of the elevators and like throwing furniture down the stairwells at their enemy classes. And it immediately struck me that this is like a perfect lens with which to look at one of our research projects. Shano Hart, she's an architect. She did a research project on what she calls addressable spaces, which is how we organize the built environment with like, numbers on doors, addresses, elevators that stop on floors, how you program elevators. Like, floor number 13 is missing in many American elevators. Chinese elevators have like other numbers like weirdly implanted in. And this novel is about like what happens when that kind of like fiction gets overlaid with like sociology. But to connect to a couple of other points, again, with J.G. Ballard, two novels of his, The Drowned World and Drought. Both of them deal with deep time. So in Drowned World, the world gets flooded with like something that looks like climate change, but it's a different premise. But as more and more water submerges the world, ancient prehistoric memories of like, dinosaur eras crop up in the genome and people start having dreams of like the Triassic era. And this was a very interesting connection point for me. One of our researchers, Kia Kreutler, she studied the relationship between memory and protocols and technology. So she goes deep into like in the Western world, how memory technologies have played a role in like the evolving civilization and how like unconscious things get sort of bubbled up. So that's like, the relationship between a fictional, speculative fictional exploration of like a conceit, basically that, we have like deep archaic memories of like 100 million years ago in our genes, with like something quite like that happens with how technology becomes a prosthetic memory. So all of us, the way we are talking, we are actually in some unconscious way accessing technologically mediated memories that go back thousands of years. That's one. And drought is another similar one where like time freezes and there's like atemporality is a theme in like protocols in urban environments where it's like you never know what time and space you're in because it all looks the same, right? But the other connection point I wanted to make again with fiction is since you brought up the quote about like science progresses one funeral at a time, we had a project by Sarah Friend about the protocols of death. So she looked at like the cultures around death, funerary protocols, but not just like literal death of people dying, but worlds dying. So online worlds, digital worlds, what happens when an online distributed game is shut down and an avatar you've become very attached to has to die? Like this has happened many times, and apparently there's like a huge lore and culture around managing these kinds of death experiences. And she also, one of the other sub-projects that she inspired was about Orkut, the social network, which became really popular in Brazil. And the Brazilian researcher we had in the program, she did a whole study on what happens when a social network dies and your entire social identity dies with it. So it's like a fiction you've created along the way. So the spectrum between like reality and fiction it's not binary. It's not that, there are novels that novelists write and then there's reality we live in. One of the things we've learned through like this protocols research is things like memory, death, identities, and personas as expressed through protocols, they're like varying degrees of friction that can go all the way to like completely like psychotic breaks from reality, and you still won't notice if it's so long as it fits into the protocol, right? It's like you could be completely insane, but so long as you're like following the rules of the protocol, it won't look insane. So yeah, there's lots of deep connections here that we've been glad to explore. There have been there's one lovely comic book that's like a speculative fiction comic book about a woman exploring the hard disk memory that Nahi Kim, one of our Korean researchers, wrote. So that's one of my favorites. And a Canadian researcher, Ritika, she wrote a series of speculative fiction set in 100 years in Canada somewhere on like what would the world look like if it were completely protocolized. So yeah, we've been able to plant a few seeds of like, can you use fiction and design fiction in powerful ways to explore research teams? And we are very happy and excited about the few seeds we've planted. And hopefully, as we continue this program, hey, maybe we'll discover the next J.G. Ballard or, a powerful writer who can like explore this for us.
I'm thinking again about the game of life and what emerged from it, from these very simple rules. Is this something that you could kind of go protocol hunting in Silico? Could you maybe like set up a series of simple rules and then let them, do their thing over 100 million iterations? And would we see emergence from kind of these in Silico type things? Or do you think that these are things, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, where these are being generated like matched from nature, what we observe in nature? The termite example is a good one. But by the way, there's all sorts of examples for human behavior that we find in nature, like bees and ants and all of the above, right? They all have protocols. And some of them are for very unsophisticated creatures, pretty sophisticated protocols. For example, the dance of a bee when they discover a new nectar or water source, you have to use advanced calculus to be able to describe the bee's dance that points the way, which like a GPS to the other bees. Here it is. So do you think trying a more randomized in silico 100 million generations would be useful, or stick with looking at the natural world?
I think one reason why it would be hard is protocols tend to operate almost on like a slower cadence than the main thing you're looking at. So if you use the example of like a bee reproducing, it's like this reproduction is like on a very slow timescale relative to like what the bee is trying to do right now, even though parts of the protocol sort of happen, like dancing around the flower. And you can think of like maybe the human version of that is, that came up a lot, was like diplomacy, right? You go to like the UN, there's all these things that like, your country does. And there are all these like micro actions that, the diplomat does and whatnot. But the entire like diplomatic protocol plays on a much slower time scale than like the agent in it. So I don't know if there's a way to observe or to see them without it being like emergent behavior at some point. And especially where like even if you define a protocol, blockchains are a great example. We did already, anyone can just write all the rules and, you define the protocol as is and you launch it. But then the interesting stuff all happens as like a consequence of the emergent behavior. Whether you look at Bitcoin, whether you look at Ethereum, none of these things were just, none of like the interesting insights you got out of these things were there when the whole protocol was created. So I think it's whatever test environment or sort of lab environment you want for this, you need to allow enough time and enough like interactions to get the meta level emerging. And that's what will show you whether like the protocol is good or bad at every step. Yeah.
Yeah, Tim, I actually want to provoke you to go deeper into crypto on this because I think it's illuminating. What's the lessons from like the testnet infrastructure that Ethereum runs? Like before you do major forks and upgrades, you run a bunch of testnets. Do you learn like game of life type emergent lessons from those?
Short answer is actually it's really hard. I wish we would learn more. But this is maybe a good example where like, on Ethereum, you want to do a change. And so you have like a testnet that's equivalent of a staging environment in like normal tech. And so we can test that like things work in the happy case and in some simulated unhappy cases. But blockchains are like super adversarial environments when they're live, so there's no way we can ever replicate the amount of just, perturbations that we see on the main Ethereum blockchain on any testnet. Even though, we build tools to like spam them and break them and we'll like shut it down and whatnot. There's a degree to which just the adversarial environment and the emergent behaviors out of that, are really hard to replicate. So yeah, I guess this convinces me that like observing in like a sterilized environment, like maybe the most valuable thing you get out of that though is just simplifying, right? So when we launch something and it breaks on a test net, obviously it's not ready to go on mainnet, and there's usually a root cause we can identify and fix, and then once we get to the point though where we think it's robust, there's always still an amount of uncertainty between going on sort of the real network because you just can't predict that. And I expect a lot of situations are similar, like that, think about like pandemic planning or emergency response, right? As being something like that, where you can do drills, right? Like you can, think, okay, what would happen? Or, war gaming is like another example. Like, even though you have all the people in the room thinking about all the bad stuff that could happen and all the edge cases, there's just some level of like, I guess it's back to Rafa's piece, like the swarm behavior that can emerge where you really can't predict that super well from the start. Or maybe you can. And again, this is maybe something where, there's some insight of like protocols that can help us predict this emergent behavior better that we just don't have today. But it's really hard.
I want to build a little bit, connecting this back to what you said about the game of life. Like now that I think of it, the game of life, it's a cellular automaton, but it's basically deterministic. It's a grid and the rules apply cell by cell. And there's no way for, even though lots of lovely complexity and interesting dynamics happen and people spend their lifetime exploring and trying to create particular things on the game of life grid, it's fundamentally a closed, deterministic, algorithmic environment. And if you try to turn the knob towards what does this look like when you add real world messiness and randomness to it, you get to you guys may be familiar with von Neumann's universal constructor, which is basically like a Turing machine on a 2D automaton grid. But one of the insights from that is Turing equivalent and it can compute everything. But if you allow for randomness, which is mutations in genetic evolution, it's like cells in the grid can randomly be flipped by noise from the outside. So you start making the cellular automaton simulation more random and capable of mutation. It starts to mimic open-ended evolution. So my sort of philosophical takeaway from that pair of examples of James Conway Game of Life versus universal constructor with mutation possibilities is open-ended evolution is categorically a higher level of phenomenon than pure simulation. And the more open an environment is, the more careful you have to be about what lessons you draw from more closed environments. So even the termite example, think of termites building their hills in a relatively stable ecological niche where the ecosystem rarely gets disturbed. There may be in some sort of equilibrium with their predators, but mutations from cosmic rays that turns the termites into weird new kinds of termites are pretty rare. So for most periods, if you're trying to draw inspiration from termites building hills, you're actually drawing inspiration from a fairly closed automaton evolutionary environment, kind of game of life. But with adversarial environments, more complex open environments where randomness can get injected in from all over the place, things get a lot messier. And you see this again, in the difference between regular gaming of the sort you might do on Xbox or PlayStation with godlike game designer who's designed the game and all its rules, versus something like Dark Forest, which is the blockchain game I mentioned earlier. It's much weirder. Weirder things can happen when you open up open-ended network of adversarial phenomena. So I think that's why Tim is being a little cautious and jumping on your thought there.
But no, and that's a great point. Another, again, coming back to the TSA example, you can think of this as something where, because it's so high stakes, there's a ton of energy being put in reducing the variance in the environment. So we could have simple TSA protocols that can be enforced anywhere because we spent so much time making sure that airports are the most sterile environment. But if you compare that with, say, actual war zone and military strategy, that has to allow for a much wider range of outcomes. But you need a much higher agency and context person to actually put those into practice. Whereas, scanning, taking the shoes off and whatever, scanning the bid is simplified, but it's the fact that it happens at an airport that allows you to have that simple of a protocol work at scale. Yeah.
One more last build on this, you can see what happens when closed protocolized swarm environments encounter things that they weren't designed for. Like you've seen those videos of army ants marching in a death spiral. That's what happens when the environment is more complex than the protocol is capable of doing. These ants are marching in circles till they die. And that's what happens for TSA level sophistication in a war zone.
I had one last on Rafa's example of swarms. This is also why you see these traditional companies like stumble on Twitter all the time, right? So if you think of like a big traditional company, they think of their comms environment as this sterile, controlled thing. And then, something happens on Twitter and it's the equivalent of like, the airport turning into a war zone where you just don't have any notion of like, how do you deal in an adversarial environment? And so that's a big distinction. Yeah.
Agility being one of the characteristics of a new company that we have found, at least, being a good indicator for how long it might succeed. If it isn't agile, that's a big red flag for it. But I also wonder, given the examples that you just gave, like TSA. So TSA is obviously designed for other things, right? It's security theater rather than, like if we think about it that way, and we think about, okay, what are the protocols to make people feel like they're safe? Then some of those TSA protocols might make sense. But it seems to me that they were looking for that as opposed to like, hey, how do we make sure that lunatics with bombs and knives don't get on here?
I think that's the most charitable interpretation. I'm
trying to be charitable.
Yeah. But and there's like an interesting Bitcoin parallel there after. But it's like if you assume these were done post 9/11, you can assume that like actual security was also a concern. And they tried to create a protocol that was actually meant to improve actual security, and maybe it's not that great, and then you sort of rewrite history a bit, and you're like, oh well, it was always about security theater, and it's actually not that bad. And I think this is something why second order impacts are hard, because Bitcoin is sort of a version of that story where you have the white paper that says it's peer-to-peer electronic cash, and Satoshi saying like, we're going to use this, we're going to buy pizza from each other and whatnot using these Bitcoins. But then we realize, 5-10 years later, it's actually never going to scale for transaction. So you can sort of rewrite a history and say, well, it wasn't actually cash. It was more like digital gold, and kind of go along with that. So I don't know enough about the TSA to know if it's like if it was security theater from day one. But there's definitely this aspect of like the protocol gets hard to change. So like maybe rewriting the social contract around it is simpler than saying, oh, if we actually wanted security and we're not getting security today, what would we have to do to change, the TSA? Or if Bitcoin actually wanted digital cash and we don't have digital cash today, how would we have to change Bitcoin to, get that? But that's a really, really hard problem with the protocol's adoption.
But that also brings up a question in my mind, which is, you read about like military, for example, heavily protocol oriented. And yet you needed a Boyd to rewrite a lot of those protocols, right? So if you're not familiar with Boyd, he basically, they're still using his aviation and fighter pilot techniques. But the problem was they were all against current protocols when he developed them. And on top of that, he was in the eyes of his superiors, a very unpleasant person to have to deal with. So jumping off from the Boyd or improving existing protocols, is there a path that leaves room for that actually for the Boyds of the world?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in that with a similar follow-up question. Is there leverage in breaking protocols, in tactically breaking certain protocols?
Yeah.
I'll quickly sort of connect the points to a couple of research projects that touched on these. So one of our researchers, David Lang, he was one of the pioneers behind this project called the Open ROV, which is an open source underwater submersible. And that's evolved now. And one of the things he's working on now is an underwater connector. So think of it as like a USB cable connector, for making underwater connections. And it's a revolutionary kind of standard that'll create open source underwater hardware. And he wrote a whole research project on the history of standards making and protocols making. And he identifies like how it went over multiple historical eras to where we are now in this age of like disruptive standards setting. But literally you take like a Boydian approach to this is an old entrenched industry with its old protocols that are like completely controlled by incumbents. And since if you want to revolutionize things, you need a new protocol. How do you do that? Well, you kind of hack it in a different way than you would expect. You don't like make up a proposal and go to the standards committee, blah, 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 like, go through the front door. You come through the back door, you like demonstrate the technology. Maybe a small startup uses it, and on the margins, you make it work, and suddenly customers are coming to your new, cheaper standard, and eventually you pressure and then attack the incumbent. So yes, Boydian strategy does apply directly to like things like standards making and protocols making. That's one connection point I wanted to make. The other connection point to our program was one of the first guest talks we did. We have a guest talk a track going on, which was weekly during the summer. Now it's bi-weekly on the off season. But one of the first ones was Jeff Mano, who is the author of a book called The Burglar's Guide to the City. And he talks about how it's a lovely book, by the way. It riffs off an essay he wrote earlier called Nakatomi Spaces, which is about the movie Die Hard, and how Bruce Willis never seems to walk through corridors or through doors. He's always going through like air ducts and ventilation shafts and things like that. And he called that Nakatomi Space after Nakatomi Towers. And that led to this book called The Burglar's Guide to the City. And of course, the idea there is that you approach a protocol environment with the eye of a burglar of how can I hack it? How can I sneak in through like the spaces the designer didn't expect? And connecting this more recently, Jeff Mano also wrote connecting this to the Israel Armed Forces official military policy, which is when moving through a built environment, never go through the front door. Like you should burst up through the floor or down through the ceiling. Now, this was like fun, exciting theory to read about like 10 years ago when Jeff wrote that essay. Now it's like a dark thought to entertain in the context of the war that's ongoing. But the point is, urban environments are another example, just like, connector standards, where because on the one hand, you have this hard, extremely slow changing, expensive to change urban built structure environment that's like, if you wanted to rewrite the city, it's very hard to do so at a hardware level. And then you've got the software level of like, traffic flowing, sewage being flowing, or like garbage being collected. And one of our researchers, Drew Austin, who's an urbanist who used to work for Uber and is now an independent guy, he kind of like took this line of thought in Jeff Mano's talk and developed it further in his essays about how the city is a protocolized environment where there's the hardware of the city and then the software of the city. And in between, there's this soft protocol layer of the city. And the way to like advance like urban planning agendas and like improve the quality of life in cities and so forth is to take this burglar's guide approach, but from like, white hat hacker way, and ask, can you actually hack the protocols of the city to work better? Like, can you like change traffic laws or traffic signal blinking patterns to make traffic flow better when, driverless cars are on the streets? Like, this is an actual problem with the cruise cars, right? So yes, it's very germane, and we did talk a lot about Boyd and like OODA loops and stuff throughout the program. It was one of the other attractors we were circling. So yes, very definitely because of their inertia, long-term, how they develop a lot of unconscious weight and mass, I would even argue that this is literally the only way you can advance protocols once they're like entrenched and settled. Like beyond the point, you can't come straight at a protocol. You have to hack it with like a Boydian approach. That's the only way to advance the sophistication of a protocol. Yeah.
To bring it back, Jim, you mentioned, when you think of companies, agility is like something that you see as like a sign of success. I think for protocols, it's a bit different because in a way, it's almost like this double-edged sword where if the protocol is too easy to change, there's also risk from that. Like you gave the example of the hospital where, people start washing their hands, things go well, and then some guy's able to come and revert that change. It makes sort of the protocol worse, right? And obviously, in Bitcoin, we have the famous like 21 million coins. If anyone can come and change this, it sort of breaks the protocol. And I think the two things there is like one, like if you think these protocols are doing good things, bike shedding, you're being able to always revert things sort of chips away at like the coordination savings that you get out of the protocols. And even beyond that, the idea that things might change in the future reduces the assurances you have in the protocol. And, whether this is, you look at politics, you look at technology, something like that, if, for example, the email protocol might completely change in a year, then you might be much less willing to write like an email client because, all of your work goes to waste. And so this is a really hard problem to deal with, though, because of all these sort of second order impacts of protocols. There's different approaches. I think if you look in crypto, where I'm most familiar, Bitcoin has this extremely strong stance of ossification, where they've agreed basically to never change the protocol, and you sort of push everything elsewhere and just sort of pray that the second order consequences are actually going to work out in a positive way. On Ethereum, we have this concept. Vitalik wrote this blog post a few years ago called functional escape velocity. So the idea is that maybe you keep changing Ethereum until you see enough stuff built on it that second ecosystem has a life of its own, and then you can slowly potentially stop changing it and sort of trust that instead of you're trusting the second order consequences directly, you're maybe trusting the second order like stewards, right? Saying like, okay, if all these people are like happy on the protocol, maybe we can like, stop changing this thing and trust them to keep going forward. And then I think that's what you were saying around like the idea of like a backdoor and having to come like obliquely with changes. I agree this has been true like pretty much in every case. And this might be one of like the most underrated innovations in blockchains and in tech, where the concept of forking, right? Where even with normal software, so normal software, for listeners who aren't familiar, if you have code on GitHub, and I'm maintaining a software project there, and it's open source, anybody can take that code and modify it, and we call this a fork. And this is great because it means, I don't have to rewrite the whole thing from scratch, and I can benefit from your changes, and maybe I send some changes in as well. But the thing you don't get out of that is like the network effects. So for example, imagine you have something like Twitter. Even if you gave me all of the Twitter code base and I launch, timtwitter.com, it's not sufficient to get people to come to twitter.com. So the one innovation we have in blockchains that's actually very neat is the idea of like this shared state. So if you own Bitcoin or Ethereum, all the nodes on the network know that, I have 1 Bitcoin, you have 2 Bitcoin and all of that. And we can fork the actual state, where if you want to make a protocol change, say that, Venkat, you wanted to double the amount of Bitcoin that there will be because you think that's the way forward. Not only can you change the software, but you can bring and copy everybody's balance over. So you can say, on Venkat Bitcoin, Jim can come and his coins are still there and the rules of the protocols have still changed. And using that, I think, might be like that idea that you can fork not only like the software, but also the current state of things and bring the network effect and kickstart it. That might be a way where in certain domains, you can get these like different flavors or different, ideas of a protocol competing against each other in a way where when you're competing and coming in as a newer player, you don't have to recreate the network effect from scratch, which is, I think, one of the biggest challenges when you look at things, either to have like technological network effects, through distribution, or even that have sort of regulatory modes, right? Like this is the whole thing around, if you look at something like the TSA and whatnot, the reason you can't go in and change it is there's all these layers of bureaucracy, and you can't just create another airport side by side with the same airport and, have everybody pass through both and sort of run the experiment. But yeah, with technology, you can. So I think this is something where hopefully, blockchains can become a useful case study of like, what does it look like to make changes to a protocol where you get the network effects and you get to actually see the sort of user preference and build on top of that.
Ed, I thought you had a question there.
I had one question, switching gears slightly, but it's going back to something Venkat mentioned earlier. And you mentioned it in the context of stories and storytelling, but one thing I really noticed from the retrospective was that several different projects seem to be focused around memory. I think there's 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly how many, but it was a sizable proportion of them. What about memory makes it such a sort of right topic to think about in the context of protocols?
That's a really good question, and I feel like we should make that a challenge question for people next year. But I'll give you kind of like a bad temporary answer. It actually connects to what Tim just said, which is a lot of the intelligence in any technological system or built environment is actually in the state, not the structure. So the history of the state, which is what memory, that's one definition of memory, is actually the most valuable asset in a civilization. Like, people often play that fun game of like, if civilization were destroyed tomorrow and you could like save one book, what would you save? That tells you that we sort of intuitively know what the valuable thing is. And I think this current generation of technology is more explicitly recognizing that everywhere. Like this is happening in AI as well. Like if you remember, 10 years ago, there was this Google paper which kicked off the big data revolution. The main premise was like more data and simpler algorithms beats less data and more complex algorithms. And that was the big data revolution. And you extrapolate that, and that's how you get modern deep learning, which is almost all the intelligence is in the data. You look at like PyTorch code for machine learning, it's like a few hundred lines. It's like some of the simplest code imaginable. It does like, the simple like backpropagation and other things compared to like really complex old code. All the intelligence is literally in the data that then gets digested into the parameter weights and so forth. And I think something similar is true of blockchains as well. The actual like code for blockchains, yes, it's complex, but the real value is like just the sheer amount of state history, and that's actually a big problem with all blockchains. Like, how do you like deal with the snowballing state? And I think one of the reasons memory has been such a big topic for us is these large time constants of how technologies change, how maintaining state and like propagating state, not just through forks, but through like very radical paradigm shifts in technology is important. Like we talked earlier about like, things like corporations and organizations, they are a current generation of organizing technology, but they carry streams of data that go back to the Roman Empire, for example. I think this is apocryphal, but the idea that, modern railway gauges and road dimensions go back to like cartwheel, wheel-based lengths to the Roman Empire. So you can see that the phenomenology, the data, it's fundamentally much more important than the superstructures we build to like exploit it or do things with it, which means that if you had a choice, the quote I'm thinking of is Frederick Brooks of the Mythical Man Month. He said something in the 1960s with like PDP operating system, something like, if you show me your code and hide your tables, I will understand nothing. But if you show me your tables and hide your code, I will understand everything about your program. So even back in the 1960s, it was apparent that the intelligence and the value in any sort of like technological assemblage of things lies in its data and memory. So I think it's not an accident that several of our researchers gravitated on like memory and related more time as kind of like the important things to poke at in understanding protocols. So evolutionary dynamics, history, how is state perpetuated, all that is like a very critical thing. And thanks for asking that question, because this now makes me think in next year's program design, we should like provoke people to think more about this angle.
And it's one where it flows so well between like the social and human side and the technological side. I think this is maybe for all of the other domains, it gets really hard to reconcile those two, except maybe the built environment, which is something where we had a ton of projects as well. These domains were like, you can feel both the like social and human side and the technological side tend to resonate more than say I work on blockchains and I get the feel for like the social side of blockchains because I'm so far down that rabbit hole. For most people, it's like just a technological thing. But I think like, memory and like built environment are these things where anyone can think of both sides and have like a strong intuition for them. And it sort of hints that there's something there between those two realms that you can touch. Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I feel like we got maybe through half of my notes. And Ed, how'd we do? You think we maybe have to do a round two here?
Yeah, just about that. Yeah, half as optimistic, but yeah, nearly there.
So this is absolutely fascinating. I think that this is a great project because I think you're right. And that explicitly looking at this and thinking about it and having these challenge questions are only going to improve the process of protocol. And I also agree that we are moving into a new era where I think the open discussion and propagation of the ideas around protocols is hitting exactly at the right time. So where can everyone find all of the materials that hopefully this podcast will get them to run off to and click on?
Yeah. So the main place to go is summerofprotocols.com. So all of the research that was done throughout the summer is going to be published openly and for anyone to access. So we've also, after reviewing everything, it felt like a lot to drop on people at once. So we've decided we're gonna scatter the release of it over the next 6 to 8 months. So summerprotocols.com is the main place people can go there. Everything will be available, and we're also putting together a limited set of physical kits which contain all of the research and a bunch of other sort of tools and interesting collateral to get people thinking and working with protocols. The kits won't be for sale. They'll all be available for free. And we're trying to get them to people who want to actually, build study groups or sort of try to advance protocol studies one way or another. So if your listeners would like to have a kit, we can give 10 away to people who email us to hello@summerprotocols.com. And tell us how they're going to use sort of the physical version of the kit to kickstart, whether it's a meetup, a study group, or put it somewhere where interesting people will get to engage with this stuff. So if you just want to get access to the research, summerprotocols.com. And if you'd like to get one of the physical kits, send us a note to hello@summerprotocols.com and explain to us what you do with it. And we'll be giving those out in the next couple months as well.
Terrific. Well, guys, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think the work is fantastic. Thank you for joining us and for helping our listeners and viewers understand protocols a little bit better. I think everyone needs to.
Thank you so much for having us.
Cheers.